The wind carried the scent of snow across the ridge, sharp and metallic in the late afternoon air. Hazel Pritchett drove the oak peg into frozen ground, with her fourth strike the hammer heavy in hands, already raw from weeks of labor. Her breath clouded white before her face, dissolving into the orange light, bleeding across the western mountains. Behind her, the half-built cabin stood at a tilt. She couldn't quite correct its log walls rising unevenly, where she'd tried to compensate for the slope alone. Canvas stretched across the skeletal roof frame, snapped and billowed with each gust, threatening to tear loose entirely. She was 32 years old, though the mirror in Red Oak's mercantile suggested 40. Swedish-Irish stock built sturdy but worn thin by the crossing, first the Atlantic in steerage, then the overland trail that had taken her husband and left her with nothing but a land deed and a grave she couldn't even mark properly. 3 months since Jonas died, and she still couldn't decide whether the claim he'd staked was a gift or a curse. The peg shifted under her next strike, driving in crooked. She cursed in Swedish, then English, and raised the hammer again. Her arms trembled with exhaustion. The cuts across her palms had reopened fresh blood, mixing with old stains on the wood handle. Her fingernails were broken to the quick, two torn away completely. The gray wool dress she wore, once respectable enough for church, was now stiff with pine sap and mud, the hem torn where it had caught on stumps during her solitary logging efforts. But she would not stop. She would not go back east to her sister's pitying household in Milwaukee, would not become the charity case everyone expected. Jonas had given her this chance, however flawed, however impossible. She would see it through or die trying. The horse snorted somewhere to her left. Hazel's hammer froze mid-swing. That sound hadn't come from her mule, which was tethered behind the cabin. This was closer, just inside the tree line, where the ponderosa pines grew thick and shadows pooled deep. Her heart began hammering harder than her fists had struck the peg. Jonas's old rifle leaned against the cabin wall 30 feet away, might as well have been 30 miles. She lowered the hammer slowly, quietly, and turned her head just enough to see without appearing to look. The bay gelding emerged first from the darkening pines, steam pouring from its nostrils, intelligent eyes watching her with what seemed like curiosity. Then, its rider. He was Lakota, she knew that instantly, from the intricate beadwork visible on his shirt beneath a buffalo hide winter cloak, from the way his black hair hung in 2 tight braids over broad shoulders, from the deliberate stillness with which he sat his horse. A carbine rifle rested across his saddle, not aimed, but present. He was perhaps 34 or 35, lean and weathered, with a thin scar running from his left temple down to his jaw line. His dark eyes assessed her with the same careful attention his horse had shown taking in the tilted cabin. The flapping canvas, the single woman with a hammer facing down, approaching night and weather. Several heartbeats passed in silence, broken only by wind and the creak of canvas. "Need a partner?" His voice was low and clear with barely a trace of accent. The words were simple, but something in his tone suggested he'd given the question careful thought before speaking. Hazel's hand slipped on the hammer handle. The peg she'd been driving skewed sideways, ruining the alignment completely. She cursed again, Swedish, this time the words her grandmother had used when the fishing nets tore and tightened her grip until her knuckles went white. "I manage," she said, the words coming out harder than she'd intended. Pride flared hot in her chest, burning away the cold and exhaustion. She had not crossed an ocean and half a continent, had not buried a husband, and staked this claim alone to accept help from a stranger. Especially not a native man, who would draw even more trouble from the whites in Red Oak than she already faced as a widow working alone. The warrior didn't move. His gelding shifted its weight, blowing frost, and he steadied the animal with a pressure so slight, Hazel almost missed it. "Saw smoke from your stove 3 days back," he said. "Haven't seen it since." "Pipe's blocked. I'll fix it." "Before or after you freeze?" The bluntness should have angered her, but exhaustion had worn her temper thin. That's my concern, not yours. I don't know you. I don't need... The rifle shot cracked across the clearing like a branch snapping in winter cold. The bullet struck frozen earth 5 feet to Hazel's right, kicking up dirt and pine needles in a spray that stung her ankles. She dropped flat on pure instinct, the hammer flying from her hand and skittering across the ground. Her heart exploded into her throat. The warrior's bay reared, but he controlled the animal with his left hand, while his right moved with practiced speed to the carbine. "Inside," he barked. But there was no inside, only canvas and gaps between logs that would stop nothing. Hazel crawled toward the cabin anyway, her dress catching on exposed Root's knees, scraping over stones and frozen mud. A second shot rang out, this one closer, punching through the canvas roof, with a sound like tearing silk. The warrior wheeled his horse and kicked it into motion, not toward safety, but directly toward the timberline below, where white smoke still hung from the shooter's position. He rode low in the saddle, moving as one with the horse, and disappeared into the pines with such speed it seemed almost impossible. Hazel pressed herself against the cabin's base logs, trying to compress her body into the smallest possible target. Her breath came in ragged gasps that burned her throat. The orange light was fading rapidly now, the sun dropping behind the western ridge and taking its meager warmth. She could hear hoofbeats in the distance, 2 horses, maybe 3, and then a shout. The warrior's voice sharp and commanding in English. Another voice answering, higher-pitched and defiant, with an edge of mockery. Then nothing but wind rattling the canvas overhead. She waited, counting her heartbeats, because it gave her something to focus on besides the terror. 100. 200. The cold seeped through her dress and into her bones despite the adrenaline. Her fingers were numb. She couldn't stop shaking. Fear and cold combined into something that made her teeth chatter. When the hoofbeats returned, a single horse this time, she nearly bolted into the trees. But it was the warrior alone now, his gelding breathing hard and flecked with sweat despite the temperature. He dismounted in a single fluid motion that spoke of decades in the saddle and walked toward her holding something small between his thumb and forefinger. He crouched at a distance that was respectful but close enough for her to see clearly what he held. A brass cartridge case still warm. A .44 Henry rimfire. "Ketchum's man," he said simply, his tone matter of fact. "Rides a roan mare. Wears a greasy hat and a fur collar. Goes by Reed Lyle." He paused, studying the cartridge with an expression that suggested familiarity. "I know this ammunition. Ketchum buys it in bulk for his men." Hazel stared at the cartridge, her mind racing. She knew the name Ketchum, everyone within 50 miles did. Silas Ketchum owned the largest ranch in the valley, ran cattle across public land he claimed as his own, and had a reputation for acquiring property through methods that lived in the gray areas between legal and criminal. She'd heard whispers that he wanted the water rights to her creek, that he'd tried to pressure Jonas into selling before they'd even finished the overland trail. "Why would he shoot at me?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. The warrior's dark eyes met hers. "Because you're on land he wants. Because you're alone and he thinks you're weak. Because, in his experience, a few shots are usually enough to make people run." He stood, rolling the cartridge between his fingers before tucking it into a beaded pouch on his belt. "He'll come back, probably with more men next time. Then I'll be ready." The words came out braver than the tremor in her hand suggested. "With what, that rusted rifle?" He nodded toward Jonas's old gun leaning against the cabin wall. "The one I can see hasn't been cleaned in months, maybe longer." Heat rushed to Hazel's face, shame and anger mixing into something sharp. "What do you want? You didn't ride down here just to tell me I'm unprepared." The warrior looked at her cabin again, then at the darkening sky. The first snowflakes were beginning to fall small and hard like grains of sand striking her cheeks. I need shelter for a few nights. You need help finishing this before the next storm hits tomorrow night, maybe sooner from the look of those clouds. 3 nights. I'll help you seal the roof properly, fix your stove, shore up that north wall before it collapses. You provide meals and keep the fire burning. I don't have much food. I have jerky cornmeal and dried apples in my packs. We'll share everything equally. Why would you help me? The question came out suspicious, because she'd learned on the trail that no one did anything without reason. He touched his left side briefly just below his ribs, and Hazel saw him wince before he could control the expression. When his hand moved away, his fingers were pressed tightly together, as if physically holding something inside his body. Because I need a warm place for this wound to heal without infection killing me, and you need to survive long enough to prove your claim is legal. He paused. It's a fair trade. Nothing more. The pragmatism was almost shocking in its honesty. No false gallantry, no pretense of charity. Just meeting need in the most basic terms of survival. Hazel found herself studying his face, looking for deception in the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his gaze. She found only exhaustion and pain barely concealed beneath a surface of careful control. The western sky had gone from orange to deep purple, streaked with red. Snow was falling faster now, visible flakes swirling in the fading light. The temperature was dropping with each passing moment. She stood brushing frozen dirt from her dress and held out her hand. 3 nights. Then you ride on. He clasped her hand once, firm and brief. His palm was burning with fever heat, and the slight tremor in his grip confirmed what she'd suspected. He was hurt, worse than he wanted to admit. 3 nights, he agreed. What do I call you? Chaska. Hazel Pritchett. He released her hand and turned toward his horse to retrieve saddlebags and bedroll. Hazel watched him move, noting the careful way he held his left side, the slight hitch in his step that suggested each movement cost him. He was forcing himself to appear stronger than he was, and she understood that impulse completely. As the first real gust of the approaching storm hit, rattling the canvas roof and sending snow swirling through the gaps between logs, Hazel wondered whether she'd just made a bargain that would save her life or complicate it beyond measure. Either way, she thought as she picked up her hammer and turned back to salvage the crooked peg, it was too late to reconsider now. The storm rolled in with the night, and survival became the only truth that mattered. Red Oak was barely a town, more like a muddy suggestion of civilization carved into the wilderness. A single street, lined with weathered buildings that seemed to lean on each other for support, a mercantile that sold everything from nails to laudanum, a saloon that doubled as the only entertainment for 50 miles, a boarding house where Dr. May Ellsworth kept her practice on the ground floor, a livery stable run by a former Confederate soldier who didn't ask questions, and a land office that stayed open 3 days a week when the county clerk bothered to make the ride from the county seat. Hazel had arrived there in late August 1875 with a wagon, a dying husband, and a land deed clutched in Jonas's coat pocket. He'd staked the claim 2 weeks before. She'd caught up with him 160 acres under the Homestead Act of 1862, timber and creek, at the base of the ridge, far enough from town to be quiet, but close enough to trade if they could make something of it. He'd been so proud, fevered, and weak as he was pressing the paper into her hands with shaking fingers and making her promise to see it through. Build the cabin, Hazel, just like we planned. Don't go back east. Promise me you'll stay and prove the claim. She'd promised, holding his hand as the fever took him in the back of that wagon. And then she'd buried him in ground so hard she'd had to pay 2 men from the saloon to finish digging the grave. The deed was legal, filed properly at the county seat, witnessed by a land office clerk, stamped with a government seal. But Jonas had never told her about the debt, about the $50 he'd borrowed from Silas Ketchum during that last desperate week, when they were running out of supplies and winter was coming. About the agreement he'd made using the deed as security, with the understanding that if he didn't repay within 60 days, the land would transfer to Ketchum's ownership. She hadn't known any of it. And now Jonas was dead, and Ketchum was circling like a buzzard, waiting for her to falter. Chaska had been watching her for 3 days before riding down. Didn't know that he'd been exiled from his Lakota band 8 months earlier for arguing against retaliation after a cavalry patrol had burned their winter food stores. His band had called him a coward, weak, too willing to bow to the whites' demands for peace when honor demanded resistance. They'd sent him away with his horse, his rifle, and the understanding that he was no longer one of them. For 8 months he'd drifted scouting for wagon trains, occasionally hunting alone, avoiding both his people and the whites as much as possible. He'd worked for Silas Ketchum briefly that previous spring, tracking cattle and scouting water sources. It had lasted 5 weeks before he'd understood what Ketchum really was. He'd watched Ketchum pressure a widow into signing over her claim, had seen Reed Lyle set fire to a squatter's tent, with the family still scrambling to get out. When he'd objected, Ketchum had laughed and paid him off with an extra $20 and a warning to keep his mouth shut. Chaska had taken the money because refusing would have been dangerous, but he'd left the next morning and hadn't returned. The memory still tasted like shame. The knife wound below his ribs, gotten in a fight with a drunk trapper 2 weeks ago, had festered despite his attempts to clean it. He needed warmth and time for his body to fight the infection before it killed him. Now, as the storm rattled the canvas overhead and snow began piling against the cabin's base, they worked in tense silence. Chaska used his knife to cut strips from an oiled tarp he carried in his saddlebags. Hazel held the strips in place while he secured them with whatever nails and rope remained, her fingers going numb within minutes despite her gloves. Overlap the edges more. Chaska said, his voice rough with suppressed pain. Water will find any gap. Hazel adjusted her grip, pressing the material tighter. Like this? Yes. Hold it steady. They worked in careful rhythm, him placing her, holding him, securing with knots that looked complicated but held fast. When they finally climbed down from the precarious roof frame, Hazel's legs shook so badly she nearly fell. Chaska caught her elbow to steady her, then released her immediately once she had her balance. Inside the cabin, he examined the stove, while Hazel lit the lantern with hands that trembled from exhaustion. The space was small, barely 12 feet by 12 feet, and the gaps between logs let in whistling drafts that made the flame flicker wildly. Pipes blocked by a bird's nest, Chaska said after peering up the rusted flue. And the whole assembly is seated wrong on the firebox. No wonder it smokes. Can you fix it? Hazel asked, hearing the desperation in her own voice. Tomorrow in daylight, when I can see properly. Tonight we use a corner fire pit. He went outside and returned multiple times, carrying flat stones to form a ring in the cabin's northeast corner, where a natural gap in the logs would let smoke escape. He worked steadily, precisely, even when she saw him pause to press his hand against his wounded side. Sit down before you collapse. Hazel finally said, her worry overriding politeness. Almost finished. You're swaying on your feet. He ignored her, stacking the last few stones with hands that shook almost imperceptibly. Only when he'd built a small fire using tinder from his pack did he finally lower himself to sit against the wall, breathing harder than the exertion warranted. Hazel knelt beside him without asking permission. Let me see. It's fine. It's infected and you know it. Let me see, or you'll be no use to either of us by morning. He met her eyes for a long moment, then slowly pulled aside his shirt. The wound was low on his left side, just above his hip, a puckered scar crusted with infection and the skin around it angry red and swollen. Clear fluid mixed with yellow pus wept from the edges. I'll need to drain it, she said, keeping her voice steady. I know. She boiled water in their single pot, sterilized her sewing needle in the flame, and then set to work by the wavering light. Chaska didn't make a sound as she lanced the wound and pressed out the infection, but his jaw locked tight enough that she heard his teeth grind. His hand curled into a fist against the floor. She worked as gently as she could, cleaning the wound with boiled water and binding it with strips torn from one of her 2 spare undershirts. When she finished, Chaska's forehead was beaded with sweat despite the cold. She pressed her palm to his skin and felt the burn of fever beneath. You need a real doctor. In the morning, if I can ride. If the storm breaks. It will. She handed him the canteen, and he drank deeply. Then she took her own turn, warming her hands by the fire while the wind howled outside and snow hissed against the canvas roof. Why did you really come down from the ridge? She asked after a long silence. Chaska was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, I worked for Ketchum once, 5 weeks last spring. Hazel's head snapped around. What? Scouting? Tracking cattle? Finding water sources? He stared into the fire. I saw what he did to people who got in his way. Saw him force a widow to sign over her claim. Saw Reed Lyle set fire to a squatter's camp. He paused. I objected once. Ketchum paid me extra to keep quiet. So I left. Hazel felt something cold settle in her stomach. You worked for the man who's trying to steal my land. Yes. And you didn't think to mention this. Would you have accepted if I had? He finally looked at her. I'm not proud of those 5 weeks, but I can try to do something right now, if you'll still let me. She wanted to be angry, but exhaustion won out. How do I know you're not still working for him? You don't, Chaska admitted. But if I were still working for Ketchum Reed, Lyle would have killed you this afternoon. I stopped him instead. He gestured to the cartridge pouch. That's your proof. She studied his face and found only exhaustion and shame. Finally, she nodded once. 3 nights. But if I find out you're lying, then you shoot me with that rusted rifle and leave me for the wolves, he finished. Fair enough. They sat in silence, after that the fire burning low between them, each alone with their thoughts, while the storm buried the world outside. Morning came gray and bitter. Hazel woke to find Chaska already awake, sitting with his back against the wall and his rifle across his lap facing the door. Thought I heard horses about an hour before dawn, he said when she stirred. Ketchum's men. Possibly. Or just making sure you know they're watching. Before they could begin work, hoofbeats approached from town. Hazel grabbed the rifle and positioned herself at the cabin's corner. Chaska moved to the opposite side, his carbine ready, but held low. The rider who emerged from the tree line was Ed Odell on his plodding mule, one hand raised in greeting. Hold fire, Hazel, just bringing news. He was a thin man in his 40s with kind eyes and a perpetual stoop. He glanced at Chaska with curiosity, but no hostility. Wanted to make sure you weathered the storm, Ed said, and to warn you Ketchum's in town talking to Deputy Pike. Claims you fired on his man Reed Lyle yesterday without provocation. That's a lie, Hazel said sharply. Reed fired first. I figured as much. But Ketchum's got a paper he's showing around, a deed he claims proves he bought this land from your husband's estate 2 weeks before Jonas died. Says you're squatting. The world tilted sideways. That's impossible. Jonas filed this claim legally. I have the deed. I believe you. But Ketchum's paper's got signatures and looks official enough that Pike can't dismiss it without investigation. Ed's expression was pained. Chaska stepped forward. This paper, what exactly did it look like? Ed described it, a handwritten deed dated late July 1875, supposedly signed by Jonas Pritchett and witnessed by a county clerk named Milton Gray. The writing was neat and formal. "It's forged," Hazel said flatly. "Jonas never sold this claim." Chaska pulled the .44 cartridge from his pouch. "Reed Lyle fired on Mrs. Pritchett yesterday evening. I found this at the shooting position. Same ammunition Ketchum buys in bulk, I know, because I worked for him briefly last spring." Ed took the cartridge, turning it over. "You willing to testify to that, if necessary?" "Might be necessary indeed." Ed looked at Hazel. "You want me to carry a message to Pike? Tell him I'll come to town myself when the trail's passable. Tell him I have proof of my legal claim." After Ed left, Hazel stared at the place where he'd stood. "I can't lose this land. It's all I have left." Chaska studied the tree line. "Then we make sure you don't. But first we finish this roof." They worked through the day, taking breaks only when Chaska's wound forced him to rest. Hazel waded into the half-frozen creek to cut willow branches, her skirts soaking up icy water. Chaska wove the branches with surprising dexterity, creating a lattice that held the canvas taut. By late afternoon, the roof was stronger. Chaska was leaning against the cabin wall when Hazel climbed down, his face pale again and the bandage showing fresh blood. "You've reopened it," she said. "It'll keep." "It won't if you don't rest." She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead. Still warm. Inside. Now. To her surprise, he didn't argue. She changed his bandage, noting the wound looked cleaner despite the fresh bleeding. Then she made them thin soup from dried venison and cornmeal. "Why did you really stop Reed yesterday?" Hazel asked. "You could have kept riding." Chaska stared into the fire. "My band sent me away because I argued for peace over resistance. Told them that fighting the cavalry would get everyone killed. They called me a coward. Maybe they were right. But you're here anyway. I'm here because I'm tired of watching powerful people crush those who can't fight back. I can't save my band, can't change my exile, but maybe I can do this one thing right." The honesty in his voice was almost painful. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're a coward. Intention doesn't change outcome. You're not there because they sent you away. That's not your fault." He didn't respond, just turned back to the fire. But something in his shoulders eased slightly. Outside, wind rattled the newly reinforced roof. It held steady. 3 days stretched into a week as the weather turned viciously unpredictable. Chaska showed no inclination to leave, despite his wound healing steadily. He worked on the cabin during every clear hour, fixing the stove's draft, properly reinforcing the north wall, cutting and fitting additional logs to raise the walls. Small moments accumulated. Chaska left his willow bark tea supplies near her sewing basket one morning. She tucked an extra blanket over him when he fell asleep by the fire. He taught her to shoot properly, his hands adjusting her grip on the rifle, his voice patient. "You're jerking the trigger," he said one afternoon. "Squeeze it slowly." She tried again, focusing on smooth pressure. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and the tin can flew backward off the log. "Better," Chaska said, and something that might have been a smile flickered across his face. One evening, Dr. May made the difficult journey to the cabin, bringing supplies and news. "Pike's gathering testimonies from anyone who's had trouble with Ketchum. I've agreed to testify about the pattern of harassment against widows." She examined Chaska's wound. "Healing well, but you need rest." After May left, Hazel asked, "Would you go back to your band if you could?" "I don't know anymore. I was right about fighting being futile. But I was also wrong about the Indian agent's promises. The rations are half what was agreed. You did what you thought was best. Does it count if they're still suffering? You're here because they sent you away. That's not your fault. Chaska looked at her, something raw in his expression. Sometimes I think you're the only person who believes that. Then I'll keep believing it until you can believe it yourself. The moment stretched between them, loaded with things neither could articulate. Then Chaska looked away and added wood to the fire. The wolves came 3 nights later. Hazel heard them first, that low, eerie howl. She was awake immediately, reaching for the rifle. Chaska was already on his feet, carbine in hand, moving to the door. He peered through a gap in the logs. 3 that I can see. Maybe a 4th. They're testing us. He opened the door a crack and fired once into the air. The howling stopped. Then after a pause, it resumed, closer now. They're starving, Chaska said quietly. He handed her his carbine. You shoot. I'll reload. My shoulder's too stiff for quick reloading. Hazel took up position at the door, while Chaska stood close behind her, near enough that she could feel the heat of his body. The wolves were shadows circling just beyond the firelight. Wait for them to come closer, Chaska murmured near her ear. Wait until you can see their teeth. The lead wolf, a big gray male, patted forward, lips curling back from fangs that gleamed. Now, Chaska said quietly. She fired. The wolf yelped and bolted, blood bright against snow. The others scattered. They'll come back, he said. They took turns through the night. Hazel's turn came in the darkest hours before dawn, and she sat wrapped in a blanket staring at the fire. When Chaska woke to take over at dawn, he found her still awake, hollow-eyed. You should have woken me sooner. I couldn't sleep anyway. He sat beside her close enough that their shoulders touched. After this storm, I'll ride north to the winter camp, see if anyone will listen. And if they won't, then we find another way forward. He looked at her. I'm not leaving until this is finished. The cabin, the claim, keeping you safe, all of it. Hazel's throat tightened. You don't owe me that much. That agreement ended a long time ago. I'm staying because I choose to. She leaned her head against his shoulder, too tired to maintain proper distance. He stiffened for just a moment, then relaxed. They stayed like that until dawn broke gray and cold. The storm finally broke on the 5th day. Deputy Pike arrived mid-morning, his face grim. I rode out to the stage depot again, he said without preamble. Found something you need to see. He led them to the old structure. Inside, Pike pulled out a rain-damaged piece of paper from behind loose boards. Hazel recognized Jonas's handwriting instantly. Silas Ketchum advanced me $50, demanded deed as security. Will reclaim once settled. Tell Hazel. He threatened me when I asked about terms in writing. Said accidents happen to people who don't cooperate. I'm afraid. The last sentence hit Hazel like a blow. This wasn't the note from her tin box. This was something Jonas had hidden here. There's more, Pike said. He showed them a scabbard with Reed Lyle's distinctive brand. Found this behind the same wall, and boot prints that match Lyle's size. Chaska took the scabbard. I know this. Lyle was wearing it when I worked for Ketchum. He bragged about having it custom made. You can testify to that? Pike asked sharply. Under oath. Pike nodded. Then here's what we have: Jonas's note proving Ketchum made threats. Reed Lyle's scabbard proving he was here when Jonas sheltered. The timeline showing Jonas died 1 week after being threatened. The forged deed showing up months later. He looked at Hazel. This isn't proof of murder yet, but it's enough to establish suspicious circumstances. I can take this to the circuit judge and demand a full investigation. Hazel stared at Jonas's note, her eyes stinging. He'd been terrified. He'd known he was in danger. "I'm sorry," Chaska said quietly beside her. She nodded, unable to speak. Pike carefully folded Jonas's note into a waxed pouch. "I'm taking this as evidence. The circuit judge arrives in 3 weeks. I'll present everything and request that Ketchum's claim be frozen pending investigation." After Pike left, they stood in the abandoned depot. "He was trying to protect you," Chaska said, "trying to leave proof. He should have told me." The words came out bitter. Maybe he thought he was protecting you by keeping you ignorant. Or maybe he was just scared. "When the circuit judge comes," Hazel said, "I want you there with me. Not as hired help, as full co-owner of this claim." Chaska looked at her sharply. "Hazel, I'm serious. We'll file the paperwork properly. Equal partnership. You've earned it. People will talk. Let them. I'm done caring." She met his eyes. "Are you?" A slow smile crossed his face. "I stopped caring the day my band exiled me." "Then we're agreed." "We're agreed." The fire came 3 nights later. Hazel was inside banking the stove when Chaska shouted from outside, "Riders, 3 of them." She grabbed the rifle. 3 men were approaching Reed Lyle in front on his roan mare, flanked by 2 others. Chaska positioned himself between the cabin and the threat. "That's far enough, Lyle." Reed reined to a stop, grinning. "Just here to deliver a message. Mr. Ketchum's willing to pay Mrs. Pritchett $500 to vacate peacefully." "This is my land?" Hazel called. "Tell Ketchum I'm not leaving." Reed's grin widened. "He figured you'd say that. That's why he authorized some encouragement." One of the other men pulled a jar from his saddlebag. "Kerosene." "Don't," Chaska said, his voice dangerous. Reed laughed. "Or what you'll shoot us that'll get you hanged, Indian." He kicked his horse forward. Chaska fired a warning shot, but Reed kept coming. The other 2 riders split off, circling. Reed reached the cabin wall and hurled the jar. It shattered kerosene, splashing across wood and canvas. He struck a match and dropped it. The flames erupted with a roar, racing across the canvas. Black smoke poured skyward. The heat drove Hazel backward. "No!" she screamed, dropping the rifle and grabbing a bucket. But it was useless. The fire was too big, too hot. Chaska shoved her behind the woodpile as one of the other men fired a shot that kicked up dirt where she'd been standing. "Stay down." He returned fire. But Reed was laughing as he circled, watching their work go up in flames. Then Chaska grunted and staggered. Hazel saw the blood spreading across his back, a bullet graze that had torn through his shirt and opened a long gash from shoulder blade to lower spine. "Chaska, I'm fine, get back." But he wasn't fine. He swayed, his face gone pale. Hazel hooked her arm around his waist and dragged him away from the burning cabin, half carrying him toward the tree line. Behind them, the canvas roof collapsed inward with a roar. Smoke choked the air. The riders didn't follow. Reed tipped his hat in a mocking salute and rode off, his laughter echoing. Hazel got Chaska into the pines and lowered him to the ground. He was breathing hard, his skin clammy. The wound was bleeding heavily. "We have to stop this bleeding," she said, her voice shaking. "The cabin is gone. You're what matters now." She tore strips from her dress and bound the wound as tightly as she could, but blood seeped through almost immediately. She couldn't move him far. Couldn't get him to town. She needed help immediately. She dragged him deeper into the trees, away from the heat and smoke, and then she ran. She made it to Ed Odell's farm just after dark, stumbling through snow and gasping. Ed took one look at her soot-stained face and grabbed his coat. It's Chaska, Hazel panted. He's shot, and the cabin Reed Lyle burned everything. We need Dr. May. Ed sent his oldest boy running for the doctor and helped Hazel onto his mule. They rode back together. By the time they reached where Hazel had left Chaska, Dr. May was already there, her medical bag open. Bullet grazed him clean, missed the spine and major vessels, but he's lost significant blood. She worked by lantern light, cleaning and stitching. Chaska was conscious, but barely. He needs rest, real rest in a warm bed. May looked at Hazel. He can't stay out here. Dr. May's clinic, Hazel said. May nodded. All right. But you're coming too. You're in shock. They loaded Chaska carefully onto Ed's wagon and made the slow journey to Red Oak, the burned cabin, a smoldering ruin behind them. Darastinam. May's clinic was cramped and cluttered. She settled Chaska onto a cot and chased Hazel into a chair, pressing bitter tea into her hands. Drink. You're in shock. Hazel drank mechanically. Her mind was spinning. The cabin was gone, the stove was gone, the tools were gone. Everything. Ketchum won, she said numbly. I have nothing left. May crouched in front of her, gripping her shoulders hard. You have your life. Chaska has his. That's more than nothing. What good is my life if I've lost everything? You haven't lost. You're alive to keep fighting. And you have people willing to fight with you. May's voice was fierce. This isn't over unless you decide it's over. Deputy Pike arrived an hour later, his face grim. Ed told me what happened. I rode out to your claim the cabin's a complete loss. I'm sorry. Can you arrest Reed Lyle now? On what evidence that will hold you and Chaska saw him, but that's your testimony against his denial. I can detain Reed for questioning, but I can only hold him until tomorrow morning. So he burns my home and nearly kills Chaska, and he faces no consequences. Not no consequences. I'm building a case. Pike pulled a folded paper from his coat. I still have the documents from the stage depot. Jonas's note is in evidence lockup, not in your cabin. We didn't lose that. And I made copies of the freight logs. Hazel felt a flicker of hope. So we still have proof? Some. Enough to present to the circuit judge in 3 weeks. I can request a formal investigation and a freeze on Ketchum's claim. Pike paused. But I have to be honest. What I have might not be enough to win outright. We need more, something that directly ties Reed or Ketchum to violence or fraud. From the cot, Chaska spoke, his voice weak. Ketchum keeps records. He's too careful not to. If he forged that deed, there'll be drafts or payments somewhere at his ranch. Pike nodded slowly. You're probably right. But I can't get a warrant without stronger probable cause. He met Hazel's eyes carefully. The line shack where Ketchum keeps winter supplies is less guarded than the main ranch. I may have overheard one of his hands mention that's where the old man keeps his strongbox. If evidence were to turn up somehow, I'd have to use it in court. The implication was clear. Hazel understood immediately. I understand, she said quietly. After Pike left, Hazel sat by Chaska's cot through the long hours, changing compresses, monitoring his breathing. Near dawn, he woke and found her sitting beside him, her hand on his wrist. You should sleep, he said hoarsely. So should you. He covered her hand with his own. I'm sorry. About the cabin. About not being fast enough. Don't. Hazel's voice broke. Don't apologize for getting shot while saving my life. But everything you worked for can be rebuilt. You can't. She squeezed his hand. When I thought you might not make it, I realized the cabin doesn't matter as much as I thought. You matter. This partnership matters. Chaska's throat worked. I don't deserve that. Neither of us deserves half of what we've been through, but we're still here. She met his eyes. I'm going after that strongbox at Ketchum's line shack. You can't go alone. I won't have a choice. You can't ride for at least a week. Hazel, I've made up my mind. Her voice was firm. You've done enough. Let me finish this. For a moment, she thought he'd argue. But then he simply nodded, understanding passing between them. She stayed beside him as dawn broke her hand in his both alive and still fighting. Hazel left Red Oak 2 hours before dawn, while Dr. May slept and Chaska lay unconscious with fever. She'd told no one her plans involving them would make them accomplices. The ride to Ketchum's line shack took 3 hours through darkness that seemed absolute. Jonas's mare picked her way carefully, and Hazel let the animal choose the path. The line shack sat in a hollow sheltered by lodgepole pines. Smoke curled from the chimney. Someone was inside. Hazel's heart sank. She tied the mare a quarter-mile away and approached on foot, moving from tree to tree. The cabin was small and rough-built. A roan mare stood in the lean-to. Reed Lyle's horse. Hazel crouched behind a deadfall, her heart hammering. Of course, Reed would be here guarding the evidence. She'd walked into a trap. She should leave. Should ride back and tell Pike she'd tried. But then she thought of Jonas's note, I'm afraid, and Chaska lying fevered in May's clinic. Thought of the months of labor reduced to ash. No, she would not run. Hazel circled the cabin, checking approaches. The window was too small. The door was the only option, and it would make noise. She needed Reed asleep or distracted. She waited as the sky lightened from black to gray. Just when she thought she couldn't bear another moment, the cabin door opened and Reed stepped out, stretching. He walked toward the lean-to check his horse. Hazel moved. She sprinted 30 yards in a crouch, every footfall carefully placed. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She reached the door and slipped inside, pulling it closed with excruciating care. The interior was dim, lit only by embers in the fireplace. And beside the fireplace sat a battered metal strongbox with a heavy padlock. Hazel grabbed a cast-iron skillet and brought it down on the lock with all her strength. The sound was catastrophic, a metallic clang that echoed forever. The lock held. She hit it again. Outside, Reed shouted. Boots pounded toward the cabin. The third strike broke the lock. Hazel threw open the lid and rifled through the contents. Land deeds, receipts, letters. Then she sawed a piece of paper in Jonas's handwriting, but cleaner than usual. A practice version with crossing out and corrections. And beneath it, another sheet in neat, formal script, the same text perfected. The forged deed. She grabbed both papers and shoved them inside her dress. The door burst open. Reed Lyle filled the doorframe. His face twisted with rage. Thought you'd be stupid enough to come here. Ketchum said you would. Hazel backed away. Reed drew a long knife. Should have burned with your cabin, he snarled, advancing. But Ketchum says make it look like an accident. Folks will believe a widow froze to death. Hazel grabbed the skillet and swung at his head. Reed blocked and lunged forward. The knife slashed toward her stomach. She twisted aside and the blade caught her dress, tearing fabric but missing flesh. They grappled, crashing against the table. Reed was stronger, heavier. Hazel fought with desperate ferocity, using elbows and knees, anything that might buy seconds. But she was losing. Reed slammed her against the wall, driving the air from her lungs, and raised the knife for a killing stroke. The rifle shot came from outside, sharp and final. The window shattered. Reed jerked and stumbled, blood spreading across his shoulder. He spun toward the window. Chaska stood 20 feet away, his carbine raised despite the blood soaking his shirt and the unsteadiness of his stance. His face was gray with pain and fever, but his hands were steady. Let her go? He said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. Reed laughed, though it sounded forced. You can barely stand, Indian. One shot and I'll gut her before you reload. Maybe, but you'll be dead before she is. Chaska's finger tightened. I'm fine with that trade. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Reed shoved Hazel hard toward the door. Take her. But this isn't finished. Hazel stumbled outside into Chaska's arms. He caught her with his free arm, never lowering the rifle. Can you ride? Yes. Then go. Now, I'll cover you. But Reed burst from the cabin with a revolver, firing wildly. Hazel dove behind a woodpile. Chaska returned fire, and Reed ducked back inside. We're pinned. Chaska said, his voice tight with pain. Blood streamed down his back. He can wait us out. Hazel looked desperately for options. Then she remembered fire and distraction. The lean-to, she said. If we fire it, the smoke will drive him out. Chaska understood immediately. Can you make the shot aim for the hay pile? Hazel took Jonas's rifle and steadied it on the woodpile. Her hands shook, but she forced herself to breathe slowly. The rifle bucked. The hay pile erupted in flames, dry material catching instantly. Reed burst from the cabin, driven by smoke and the threat to his horse. He fired at Hazel's position bullets, splintering wood. Chaska returned fire, forcing Reed toward the trees. Then hoofbeats approached from the south, multiple horses. Deputy Pike appeared with 2 deputized townsmen, rifles ready. Drop your weapon, Reed. You're under arrest. Reed fired at Pike instead. The deputies returned fire, and Reed went down with a bullet through his chest, blood spreading across snow. He twitched once and then lay still. Behind Reed, emerging from the trail to the main ranch, came Silas Ketchum himself, a stocky man with cold eyes. He reined to a stop, taking in the burning lean-to Reed's body, Pike's drawn rifle. Deputy, Ketchum said smoothly. This woman broke into my property and killed my employee. I want her arrested. Funny, Pike said, not lowering his rifle. I want you arrested for fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and about 6 other crimes. He gestured to a deputy. Search him and check that strongbox. You can't search without a warrant. This is an active crime and the evidence is in plain sight. I'm seizing it. Pike's voice was hard. You made a mistake, Silas. You pushed too hard and left too clear a trail. It's over. Ketchum's smile faded. As the deputy pulled him from his horse and bound his hands, Pike approached Hazel. You all right? Yes. I have the forged deed. Both versions. She pulled the papers from her dress. This proves Ketchum had Reed forge my husband's signature. Pike took the documents carefully. This combined with what I found at the depot and the testimonies. We've got him. He looked at Chaska, who had slumped against a tree. We need to get him to Dr. May before he bleeds out. They made it back to Red Oak in a blur. Dr. May took one look at Chaska and immediately began cutting away his shirt, cursing about stubborn fools. But her hands were gentle. He'll live, she told Hazel, but only because he's too stubborn to die. Keep him here for at least a week. No arguments. The circuit judge arrived 3 weeks later, a stern man named Hartley with gray whiskers and a reputation for fairness. The trial took place in the saloon, packed with townspeople. Deputy Pike presented his case methodically, the forged deed with both versions. The payments to Milton Gray documented in Ketchum's ledgers. Jonas's note from the depot expressing fear. The freight records showing Reed Lyle present when Jonas died. Dr. May's testimony about the pattern of harassment. Ed Odell's testimony about threats. Chaska's testimony about witnessing Reed's attack and his own time working for Ketchum. Ketchum's lawyer brought in from Denver tried to argue everything was circumstantial, that Jonas might have agreed verbally, that Reed had acted independently. Then Hazel took the stand. She spoke clearly, describing Jonas's final weeks, his fear the debt Ketchum had used to trap him. She produced the note from Jonas's tin box, mentioning the October 15th deadline. She explained how the forged deed had appeared only after Jonas conveniently died, how Reed had shot at her, burned her cabin, nearly killed Chaska. "My husband wasn't perfect," she said, meeting the judge's eyes. "He made mistakes, including borrowing money he couldn't repay. But he didn't deserve to die for those mistakes. And I don't deserve to lose everything, because a powerful man decided my land was worth more than my life." The judge examined all evidence in silence, then looked at Ketchum. "Mr. Ketchum, I find the evidence compelling and comprehensive. The forged deed alone would be sufficient, but combined with the pattern of intimidation, the suspicious death of Mr. Pritchett, and your employee's actions." He paused. "I hereby find you guilty of fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and multiple counts of criminal intimidation. You are sentenced to 12 years in territorial prison. Your assets will be frozen and audited to compensate your victims." Ketchum's face went purple with rage, but deputies had him in custody. The judge turned to Hazel. "Mrs. Pritchett, your claim is validated and confirmed. The land is legally yours, free of any encumbrance. I apologize that justice took so long." Spring came slowly to the ridge, melting snow in uneven patches and turning ground to mud before finally yielding to green grass and wildflowers. By April 1876, 5 months after the trial, the new cabin stood where the old one had burned, this time built properly with Chaska's expert joinery, and help from Ed Odell and a dozen townspeople who decided that a widow and an exiled Lakota man defending their land was a story worth supporting. The cabin was larger than the original, with a proper stone chimney and a porch facing south. The stove heated the space evenly. The roof was shingled properly and didn't leak. But the project that consumed most of their energy was the sawmill. Chaska's design utilized the creek's natural flume, where it ran under the basalt shelf. A water wheel turned in the current, driving a saw blade that cut timber from their pine stand. It had taken 3 months to build, with Hazel learning carpentry techniques she'd never imagined needing, and Chaska working despite May's constant warnings. On a morning in early May, with the creek swollen from snowmelt, they finally tested the mill. Hazel and Chaska stood in the mill shed, watching water pour over the wheel. The wheel groaned, resisted, then began to turn slowly at first, then faster. The saw blade caught and spun, biting into a waiting log with a high, clean whine. Sawdust sprayed into the air, bright yellow and fragrant. "It works." Hazel breathed wonder in her voice. "It works." Chaska agreed, satisfaction in his tone. They fed the log through together, working in synchronized rhythm. Hazel guided the lever, while Chaska positioned the timber, both soaked by spray, but neither caring. When the log was cut clean through, they stepped back and looked at each other, accomplishment written in their exhausted faces. "We did it," Hazel said. "We did." She reached out and took his hand, and their fingers intertwining naturally. "Thank you. For staying. For fighting. For everything." Chaska squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for letting me stay. For trusting me despite my past. For giving me something worth fighting for." They stood like that for a long moment, the mill humming around them. Then Hazel said, "I have the partnership papers from Pike. Legal documents making us co-owners of this land and the mill. All it needs is our signatures and witnesses. You're certain people still talk. Let them. I've spent too much of my life caring what people think." She met his eyes. "You're my partner, Chaska, in every way that matters. I want it documented legally, so there's never any question." He smiled a real smile, warm and genuine. "Then let's make it legal." That afternoon, Pike and Dr. May came to the cabin as witnesses. Ed Odell brought his family and several townspeople arrived, bearing gifts, nails, tools, preserved food, a quilted blanket. The community that had once viewed Hazel with pity and Chaska with suspicion had slowly transformed into genuine support. The partnership document was simple and clear. Hazel Pritchett and Chaska were equal owners of the claim, the cabin, the mill, and any future ventures. All property jointly held, all decisions jointly made. Pike and May signed as witnesses, and the document was filed officially. After everyone left, Hazel and Chaska stood on their new porch, watching the sun set behind the western ridge. The same ridge where Chaska had first appeared 9 months ago, asking if she needed a partner. "Your band," Hazel said quietly. "Have you heard from them?" "Some. Word travels. They know about the trial, about the mill." He paused. "They sent a message through the Indian agent. Said I could return if I wanted." Hazel's chest tightened. "Do you want to?" "No." He turned to look at her. "I have a home here, a purpose, a partner." His voice dropped lower. "More than a partner, if you'd allow it." Hazel felt her breath catch. They'd danced around this truth for months. "I'd allow it," she said softly. "I'd welcome it." Chaska lifted his free hand and cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I never thought I'd find this. After the exile, after losing everything, I thought I was just surviving. But it's more than survival. It's living," Hazel finished. "Actually living, not just enduring." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. Their lips met in a kiss that was tender and careful, carrying all the weight of the past 9 months, the fear, the pain, the trust built through shared adversity. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "The town will definitely talk now," Hazel said. "Undoubtedly." "I don't care." "Neither do I." They stood together as twilight deepened, the stars emerging one by one. The creek murmured below. The mill wheel creaked gently. The cabin, their cabin, legally and completely theirs, stood solid behind them. It hadn't been the life Hazel had planned when she'd crossed the ocean with Jonas. It certainly wasn't the traditional path society expected. But it was real and earned and built on a foundation of trust and equality that would have been impossible under other circumstances. Next spring, Chaska said, "We could expand the mill, add a second wheel process lumber for the railroad expansion. And maybe add a room to the cabin," Hazel suggested, "for whatever the future brings." He smiled and pulled her closer, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into his warmth, feeling utterly at peace, for the first time since Jonas died. They'd started as strangers meeting in desperation. They'd become partners through necessity. And somewhere along the way, through fire and blood and stubborn determination, they'd become something deeper, two people who'd found in each other the home they'd both been searching for. The ridge where Chaska had first appeared was dark now, just a silhouette against the star-filled sky. But Hazel looked at it without fear or resentment. That ridge had brought her the partner she'd needed when she'd been too proud and desperate to ask for help. Sometimes she thought salvation arrived unexpectedly, not as a rescue from a storybook, but as a practical question asked by a wounded stranger. Need a partner? Yes. She'd needed one more than she'd known, and she'd found not just a partner, but everything that came with true partnership: trust, respect, affection, and the possibility of a future built together. One morning in June, Hazel woke before dawn and found Chaska already outside, standing at the edge of the clearing where their rebuilt cabin met the forest. He was looking toward the eastern horizon where the sun would soon rise. His posture relaxed in a way she'd rarely seen during those first desperate months. She joined him, slipping her hand into his. He glanced down at her and smiled, that small, genuine smile that still made her chest feel warm. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "How different things could have been," he said quietly. "If I'd ridden past that day instead of stopping. If you'd sent me away. If either of us had given up when Ketchum burned the cabin. But we didn't. No, we didn't." He squeezed her hand. "My grandmother used to say that the spirits guide us to where we need to be, even when we don't understand the path. I didn't believe her for a long time. After the exile, I thought I was just wandering without purpose. And now I think maybe she was right. I needed to find this place, needed to find you." He turned to face her fully. "I'm home, Hazel. For the first time since I can remember, I'm actually home." Tears pricked Hazel's eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came from relief and joy, rather than grief. "So am I." The sun broke over the horizon, spilling golden light across their land. The creek caught the light and sparkled. The mill wheel gleamed with morning dew. The cabin stood solid and welcoming smoke rising from the chimney May had helped them build properly. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of Ed Odell's wagon approaching. He'd promised to bring lumber orders from 3 new families settling in the valley. Business was growing. Their reputation as fair dealers and skilled craftsmen had spread. "Ready for another day?" Chaska asked. "With you always." They walked back to the cabin together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. The partnership that had begun with a desperate bargain during a snowstorm had become something neither of them could have predicted, a true union of equals built on respect and trust, and the kind of love that came from truly knowing another person's strengths and weaknesses, and choosing them anyway. The wind carried the scent of pine and fresh-cut lumber across the clearing. The mill wheel turned steadily ready for the day's work. And on the porch of their cabin, Hazel paused to look back one more time at the ridge where everything had changed. She'd been building her cabin one log at a time alone, and terrified and too proud to admit she needed help. Then a Lakota warrior had appeared from the trees and asked a simple question that had changed everything. Need a partner? Yes. She'd needed a partner. And she'd found one in the most unexpected way, at the most desperate moment from the most unlikely source. Sometimes survival required accepting help. Sometimes strength meant admitting weakness. And sometimes the best partnerships were the ones forged in fire, tested by adversity, and tempered by the simple choice to keep showing up for each other day after day, no matter what. The rest of their story would be written in the ordinary moments, the quiet mornings, the shared meals, the small triumphs and inevitable setbacks of building a life together. But the foundation was solid now, built on everything they'd survived and overcome. Hazel Pritchett and Chaska had won their land, their freedom, and each other. And that, she thought, as she stepped into the warm cabin where coffee was already brewing, was more than enough. It was everything.